This is the video abstract for our article Towards an Abolitionist Feminist Peace, State Violence, Anti-Militarism and the Women, Peace and Security Agenda by Hannah Wright and myself, Columba Akaleo-Sal, published in Review of International Studies.
The article puts two literatures and feminist political movements in conversation with one another. One is abolition feminism, and the other the UN Women, Peace and Security Agenda, or WPS. While both political projects address the question of how to prevent gender violence and build feminist peace, they propose very different political strategies for doing so. We argue that abolition feminism helps explain the WPS agenda's shortcomings, as well as pointing toward more coherent strategies to realise feminist peace. The article asks, how would abolition feminism explain why the WPS agenda has often failed to make progress toward a radical vision of feminist peace? And what does abolition feminism demand of the WPS agenda?
We begin with the history of United Nations Security Council Resolution 1325 and trace the resolution through two dominant origin stories that highlight how the WPS ecosystem both invokes and disavows a radical notion of feminist peace. The first origin story traces the resolution's history through several decades of feminist peace activism. Some of the organisations that advocated for the adoption of 1325 pursued a radical conceptualisation of feminist peace rooted in anti-militarism, anti-capitalism and anti-imperialism. A second origin story emphasises that 1325 was also the product of a collaboration between NGOs and UN gender equality advocates, rooted in liberal notions of feminist peacebuilding rather than anti-militarism. WPS advocate critics therefore variously highlight how the agenda is complicit with militarism, coloniality, and neoliberal capitalism. To move beyond this, we explore how abolition feminism explains these complicities and helps us identify alternative pathways to feminist peace.
Abolition feminists demand the abolition of systems of state violence, such as policing, prisons, borders, and militaries, working instead to transform the societal conditions and structures that make these systems appear necessary. In contrast, although some WPS advocates demand the abolition of specific military institutions, such as NATO, foreign military bases, or technologies like nuclear weapons, this rarely extends to other state security institutions. WPS policies often aim to reform institutions that abolitionists seek to dismantle, and often invoke carceral feminisms that are heavily critiqued by abolitionist movements. And yet, the anti-militarist feminist peace project that underpins more radical strands of WPS activism has strong commonalities with abolition feminism. While some WPS advocates have suggested looking to abolition feminism for ways forward, we extend this conversation by exploring how abolitionist thought might offer more realistic pathways to achieving that anti-militarist, anti-colonial, and anti-capitalist vision of feminist peace.
To do so, we turn to Andre Gortz, who introduced the framework of reformist reforms, those that shore up the status quo, and non-reformist reforms, those that advance revolutionary change. We argue that much of the agenda is pursued in ways that make it overarchingly reformist in character, undermining the transformative potential that more radical anti-militarist WPS advocates envisage. Even some reforms envisaged as non-reformist by WPS scholarship would typically be characterised as reformist by an abolitionist analysis because, in practice, they tend to attract funding and legitimacy to institutions whose function is inherently violent.
We argue that if feminist peace demands an end to militarism, capitalism, and coloniality, then this should entail not only the closure of military institutions, but the dismantling of these interlinked systems of coercion and control, like policing, prisons, and borders, that make the persistence of racial capitalism tenable. Thinking about state violence in this way demands a more far-reaching critique of WPS than even its more radical anti-militarist critics and adherents typically put forward.
Finally, we consider some implications and potential questions of this broader conceptualization of militarism for WPS and propose avenues for future research, including areas where anti-carceral logics and practices already existing within WPS could potentially be extended. These questions include asking, how does abolitionist analysis translate across different geographies, epistemological positions, languages and ways of organising? And what does the rejection of carceral solutions to conflict-related sexual violence mean for feminist peace activists?
In conclusion, although the concept of non-reformist reforms doesn't offer a simple blueprint for political organisers, and nor does it claim to, it offers ways of developing more realistic strategies for achieving feminist peace, even as it raises further questions. As for the future of WPS, it remains an open question whether what would remain after abolishing the security institutions that implement it could still be called women, peace and security. In the meantime, there is a need for contextually situated analyses of whether and which aspects of the agenda, if any, could be strategically leveraged in non-reformist ways. It's worth remembering that although WPS and feminist peace are often treated synonymously, they've never been coterminous. Feminist peace work was happening long before WPS existed, and the agenda need not contain all feminist approaches to peace. We also see a danger that abolitionist ideas taken up by neoliberal institutions like NGOs would be watered down and co-opted. We reiterate, in the words of Avia Day and Shanice McBean, that abolition cannot be anything other than a revolutionary anti-capitalist project.